Friends, we are in for such a wonderful conversation today with the amazing Kay Warren. As you probably know, Kay and her husband Rick founded Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, California, which I've been to on many occasions and love your church. They founded it in 1980 and it's 2024. So your church is 44 years old. Wow, that's amazing. And Rick retired in September 2022, but I imagine y'all are still like royalty around on that place. Your church is like Disney World, by the way. We were in shock when we came. It's amazing.
It's a bit much. It can be a bit much. Yes. Yeah.
It's so much fun. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
And Kay, after the death of her son Matthew, who lived with serious mental illness for most of his life, Kay founded Saddleback's Hope for Mental Health initiative as a way to support individuals and family members of loved ones with mental illness and suicidal ideation. In 2019, Kay started Breathe, a ministry to support parents of children with serious mental illness. Breathe events include weekend respite retreats, online retreats, and free Zoom calls with mental health professionals. And I must tell you, my work is essentially disability advocacy and respite for families with children of special needs and bridging that with adults who have some sort of disability. But I am super aware of the invisible wheelchairs, I call them, of all kinds that are happening inside of our bodies. And I'm not normally speaking to directly mental illness. I'm more speaking of all the things that are not okay in all of our stories, which you and I both have. But specifically speaking into mental illness, and this ministry just sounds amazing. And I'm already thinking maybe you should come to camp this summer and do a session, because so many families walking through physical disability have mental health issues also in the story, honestly.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, let's talk. Yeah. That'd be fun.
Well, welcome, Kay. What a blessing that you're here. And I hate to ask you right out of the gate about Matthew's death, but it seems to me, even in reading that introduction and knowing your story, that similar to my own, my deep tragedy has become such an important platform to share of the goodness of God and to really minister to other hurting hearts. And it seems like you are doing exactly that. So I'd love for you to speak to that if you would.
Sure. Matthew was our third child. He had an older sister and an older brother. And Matthew, my pregnancy was very, 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 very difficult. And we wonder now if, something happened in gestation, when he was being formed, in my womb, because he had mental illness from the time he was a toddler. We didn't know that. We knew he was different than his older brother and sister, but just attributed that to being different. It never occurred to us that those differences and some of that behavior and things that were so hard to manage could have anything to do with mental illness. I mean, He was diagnosed when he was 7 with clinical depression, but he probably could have been diagnosed much younger if we had known that children experience mental health challenges. I remember asking our children's pastor at the time, when he was walking around the house saying, I feel sad. And he didn't want to play with his toys, and he didn't want to play video games, and he didn't want to hang out with his, neighbors, and he wasn't doing well at school. And it just was clear something was really off. And I remember asking our children's pastor, can children have mental illness? And she said, I think so. And, from there I began to look and realize that my precious little boy was depressed.
Yeah.
And it kind of went from there. He had, through his life, the next 20 years, he was diagnosed with ADHD, early onset bipolar, suicidal ideation, OCD, major depressive disorder,
Oh,
borderline
wow.
personality disorder,
Wow.
body dysmorphic disorder. And really what I
Oh,
say all that to say, really what that means is that mental illness is complicated. Did he
right.
have all of those different diagnoses? I don't know. What it says is he suffered, he struggled,
Mm.
he was tortured mentally, and he lived a very tortured existence for those 20 years. So
Mm.
it's complicated,
Right.
it can be very complicated, especially if you have serious mental illness as he did.
Isn't it so complicated? We have a population at our summer camp for families where someone has a physical disability, largely, although we do actually have several who are coping with the physical ramifications of a mental
Yes.
illness, actually.
Yes.
So we kind of have both.
Yeah.
But for so many in the population, um, there is so complex and unknown, and there's this fear of what don't we know, and the doctors have said the wrong things, and there's a lot of just confusion, and
Yeah. And
that is
sometimes we don't really know exactly. We just know that something's not right.
right.
That our child or it is
uh,
not thriving, is not
right,
flourishing. And
right,
when that goes on for a period of time, you do have to kind of take a step back and go, well, is this due to a mental health challenge? And
right,
most people do not have the severity that Matthew did. The word or the term mental illness doesn't automatically mean that somebody's going to have a life like Matthew.
right.
It's not true. It
Yes.
occurs on a spectrum. He just happened to have a lot going on.
I am so sorry. I can't
Me
imagine.
too.
Yeah, I
Me
can't
too.
imagine. And yet I hate saying those words because that probably makes you feel more alone than I can't imagine. And yet losing a
No,
child. Oh,
no, actually, Catherine, it's a pretty empathetic response. If you had just said, um, "Oh yeah, I've been having trouble with getting my kid to do his homework,"
right.
that would
Yeah.
be a response that would not be good.
Isn't that the
Um,
truth?
or
Isn't that
or
the truth?
Or if you said, wow, I guess you guys are really praying about it, right?
Right.
Those are the kind of responses that but for you to say, I can't imagine what that would be
Yeah.
like, is actually acknowledging the enormity
Right.
of what has happened to us. And
Mm.
also the fact that while you may not know it exactly, I hear empathy in your tone. And so
Well,
that's
you
an okay.
should. You should, Kay.
Yeah.
You're kind to say that. I cry too much for sure, but I'm
Mm,
in tears over here.
mm.
Um, and I used to be ashamed of how easily I cry and how empathetic I am, but I have recognized the Lord just really instilled in me a longing to get in there with people and say, I'm not going to give you the ministry of truth right now. I'm going to give
Right.
you the ministry of tears and let that be a balm that, yeah, your heart's been broken.
Now, those are
And
soothing, that those your tears are a gift to the rest of us, because it there's nothing sweeter than to feel like somebody is touched by your pain and
absolutely.
your suffering. So
Mm,
your
I could not
tears
agree more.
they comfort me, and I know they comfort so many people who are around you.
Oh, well, you are kind to say that. And I have so many times seen the power of letting your heart break, of not denying the emotions that God has given us, but saying, I'm going to allow my circumstances to break my heart. And only then can I truly accept my circumstances when I'm really feeling the emotions. And the other thing I would tell you that happening probably a whole lot for you and a whole lot for me is that when we are telling our stories to empathetic listeners, it changes how we feel about our story.
It does.
And that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That power of the Me Too, that Me Too moment, regardless of what the shared experience, to feel not alone in it is, so like I said, rather than making me feel alone when you said I can't imagine, it actually drew me to you, because you had your own set of, I can't imagine what you have lived through, Catherine. I don't have a clue of what that is like. But
Yeah.
rather than that being creating distance between us, it just says there is such a thing as enormous suffering in this world. And I may not know your experience of suffering, but I see the suffering in you. You see the suffering in me. And that in itself makes us not be alone on this very lonely planet.
Isn't that the truth? There is this shared camaraderie in deep suffering. It's this holy tribe. It's a sacred space of, we're all kind of living on the edge of some really hard stuff. And sometimes it's hard to be here. And it's a gift we get to give each other. I love the words of Henry Nouwen that we are able to be wounded healers for each other. I think that's such a beautiful.
Oh, you bring up Henry Nouwen, and girl, you got me.
Oh, I know,
I'm yours
right?
forever.
Yeah,
you talk about Henry Nouwen, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that notion of being a wounded healer is really anybody who's in touch with reality. Because we're
well,
and
Lewis Smith. I mean, Nouwen is seriously. If you wanted to just talk about Henry Nouwen and trade Henry Nouwen quotes, we could do that forever, and I would love it. But
I love that.
But somebody else who has really ministered to me, well, several people, but one of them is Lewis Smedes, and he was a professor at Fuller's, and he's in heaven now. But he talked about he was one of the first who really taught me about the idea of suffering with another person, that when we suffer, when we intentionally choose to enter into the suffering of another person and suffer with them, that we are never more Christ-like, that is exactly what Jesus did. He came to suffer with us and then suffer for us, but he didn't suffer for us until he had already suffered with us. And it's because he could feel our pains, because he could feel our infirmities, because he could get with our intense need, then he could choose to suffer for us. And I think that when we as individuals make that conscious decision to enter into the pain of another person and suffer with them as though it is our own suffering, then that is probably one of the ways we are most Christ-like in our world, and is one of the sweetest ways we can bless each other, is to suffer with another person.
Absolutely. I think the word compassion means to suffer, or to suffer with even, right? I mean, that's pretty cool. We get to be compassionate listeners, compassionate companions in this world. And it's a gift. It's a practice for sure. I've recently, actually just before this podcast, I had a sweet friend over whose son had a massive stroke out of absolutely nowhere. And they are dealing with the horrific ramifications of all of it. It's been a very hard journey. He's now partially disabled still and crawling. He's 16 years old or 15 years old and climbing out of a hole. And practicing truly empathetic listening and not trying to fix it is hard on many levels. It is hard to show up and not offer advice or put a happy bow on it. I call it putting a Jesus sticker on a band, or no, I call it putting a Jesus Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Like you're going to need a lot more of Jesus, but in the moment, back to the ministry of tears, that's what you need the most.
Absolutely.
And it has been a practice in my life. I've actually started a suffering club where I host women in deep pain to to practice empathetic listening and not
Yeah.
fixing. And it's a
Yeah.
powerful process to create compassion. It actually creates our ability to show true, real empathy and
This is what I have found in talking to so many people who have lost a loved one to suicide. I cannot tell you the number, hundreds of people in the last 11 years that I have listened to their story, most often parents, because of having lost a child to suicide. All the parents who've lost a child to suicide, many seek me or Rick out. And in that process, in that sitting with people and not trying to fix it. How I can't fix the fact that their child is dead.
right,
I mean, I can't fix that. There's
right.
nothing I can do. All I can do is hold people as they accept a reality they cannot change
Mm,
and a reality they would very much like to change, but
right.
there is nothing they or I can do to change reality. But as we sit together and weep and look at what cannot be altered, and how to embrace that inside of yourself, and then live again, is sacred work. It's
Mm,
sacred ministry. It is a privilege,
yeah,
actually,
yeah,
to be with people in that very, very dark place and not sugarcoat it, not
right,
even attempt in any way to look for the blessing in the immediacy
right.
of it. It is really just be with people as they accept reality.
Oh, for sure. Kay, I had a massive stroke 15 years ago, and probably similar to you and Rick with children who've experienced suicide. Um, if somebody has like a stroke or significant disability in the story, or honestly just really bad suffering of all kinds, they're going to seek me out. And I've had a lot of what could have been extremely awkward interactions with a whole lot of people of all kinds of suffering. And just being able to be in the moment and look people in the eye and say, yes, you can accept this horrid
Yeah,
reality and live with joy, knowing that it is a horrible reality, that you get
exactly.
to decide
Yeah,
how to feel now. And
yeah.
that's after much time and much processing
Right,
and
right,
marinating. But I like
right.
to say that we get to disrupt the lie, the idol, that joy can only come in a pain-free life, because that isn't
Whew,
right.
that's good. That
Thanks.
is
I
really
agree.
good, Catherine.
Well,
That's
thank
really
you.
good.
And that's it. We get to be joy rebels. We get to rebel to the darkness with deep joy.
Absolutely.
So I see
Yeah.
you so beautifully being able to do that. And I would love to hear a minute about Breathe, about what's going on with Breathe today. It was
Yeah.
founded in 2019. Is that right?
Yeah. 2019, about 6 years after Matthew passed away, and I spent the first 6 years of after his death, as I said, talking to so many people. I did a lot of suicide prevention events. I was on a national task force about suicide prevention. I was kind of the speaker that people wanted at conferences to talk about mental health, and I did a lot of that, but I did so much personal comforting and counseling with people who had lost someone to suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And around 2019, early in 2019, I just found myself saturated. I even talked to a spiritual director and I said, I feel like the ground of my heart is so saturated. I cannot listen to another suicide loss story. I know that this is what God has called me to do. I'm not going to waste our sorrow. I'm not going to waste our experience. I'm not going to waste my son's life by not talking about it. But I don't know how I can do this the rest of my life because there
Yeah.
isn't any, well, I'll just say it. There wasn't any joy in it at that moment. It had gotten to where I couldn't hear another story of loss. I couldn't hear another person bear another person's pain about
Mm.
trying to figure out how to put their devastated family back together. So as I talked to the spiritual director and I said, I just feel like there's been so much rain that the ground of my heart is saturated and I don't know I can't give up this ministry, but I've got to find somehow something in it that brings some lightness and joy to it, or I don't know how I can carry all this
Mm-hmm.
sorrow, mine and everybody else's. And she really encouraged me to look for a way that we prayed for a way that God would bring some joy into this ministry, this hard ministry. And uh, at the same time, another friend who had 4 children, who had serious mental illness, said to me, "Have you ever thought about having a retreat for mothers who have children with serious mental illness?" And I said, "Well, I've thought about it, but I don't know, never done it." And she's like, "I think you should do that." And I got off the phone with her and I thought, this is it. This is the place that God is going to use to bring joy. It will use my experience, use our suffering, use what we've learned, but also do it in a way that was going to bring joy. And so I started this Breathe retreat, and I called it Breathe because when I was a little girl, we would travel from San Diego to Arizona, where my
Mm-hmm.
grandmother lived. And that was in the day when there weren't fast food, stops at every corner between. There just weren't. We didn't have any money. Even if we did, we didn't have money to stay in a hotel. So we would just drive at night and in the cool of the day to get to my grandmother in Phoenix. And there were these rest stops, though. Every 20 to 40 miles, there was a rest stop, and it was clean. It had bathrooms. You could get out, you could walk around, and we lived for those rest stops. And when I was thinking about naming this retreat and this ministry, I named it Breathe in honor of those rest stops. Because children who have, or people who have serious mental illness, it's likely to be a lifelong journey. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily
Yeah.
something that's going to go away,
Mm.
but you've got to have some places to rest along the journey where you get out of your car and you take in some deep breaths and you refresh yourself with, go to the
Mm.
bathroom, you get something to
Yeah.
drink, and then you get
Yeah.
back in your car on that long journey. But you've had a moment to breathe. So I named the retreat and all the minutes that we're doing to parents Breathe, with the idea of we're going to be a rest stop. We're going to be
Mm.
a respite place where you come. We're going to pamper you. We're going to meet every need. One of the moms said, "You guys do everything but chew our food." And it's like, yes, we want to serve
Yeah.
you. It's a high touch, high um, need meeting weekend where we just offer moms the opportunity to be in beauty. I believe beauty is restorative and healing. So to be in beauty, to be where they can reconnect with God, because many times suffering does not immediately lend us to intimacy with God. It actually tries to rip us away from intimacy with God. And so to reconnect people with God,
Yeah.
connect them with other people in similar circumstances, and
Mm-hmm.
just pump them full of God's goodness, His mercy, His kindness, connection, and then send them back home where they're going
Right.
to have the same circumstances they had on Friday that they now have on Monday when they go home. But hopefully they've been filled up enough, they've breathed so that they can keep going
Mm.
on this very long journey. I get to talk to them about how we can have hope for our children, but our hope is not in our children. It's not in an outcome. Our hope is not in an outcome. Our hope is in Jesus.
Mm.
And to be able to, it has brought me tremendous amounts of joy.
I love that. I very selfish isn't the right word, but I'm selfishly so happy that you have that joy. Um because you get the secret. Kay, it is so meaningful that we're doing the same thing. My husband and I founded a camp for families where anyone who has a disability, child or
Yeah,
adult, can come and have a week-long respite experience. And
yeah,
it's like a retreat. Sounds like a breeze retreat in many ways,
yeah,
happening for the mamas and the ladies with disabilities, and then the children separately. And it's a similar deep breath,
yeah,
a place to
yes,
breathe. And it's
yeah,
also, in my opinion, and I think you would echo this, it is celebrating the process and not the outcome. Because
absolutely.
for families with disabilities, and I imagine for parents of children with mental illness, we don't know any outcomes, but we can celebrate the
We don't.
process.
And the outcome, the reality is the outcome could be really bad. I mean, that's part of what we talk about at Breathe is
Mm.
Walter Brueggemann. I've come to love Walter Brueggemann, the theologian. His stuff has just given me life in this
Mm,
season
mm,
of
mm,
my own life. But he talks about that we can't get to joy, we can't get to all of that until we're willing to go through grief. And
mm,
we want to jump over grief to joy, and you can't. The only way to joy is through grief, and grief often for the mamas that I'm working with comes when they look at the reality of bad stuff has already happened, and bad stuff could happen again, even in
mhm,
other ways, and we aren't necessarily in control of that. But looking at that reality will lead you to grief, and then from grief you can experience the kind of joy that's what I call gritty faith. It's not a
mm.
pretty faith. Catherine, you
Yeah.
and I, we don't have pretty faith anymore.
Yeah, we
We
don't have
have
that
gritty faith.
luxury.
No, 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 we have
Right.
gritty faith.
Yep.
And that's what I'm hoping to instill in and lead gently
Mm,
these mamas to a place of gritty faith.
I love
That
that.
yeah,
Gritty faith,
yeah,
that's it. Grit and grace is what we're wanting to cultivate. And I
yeah,
think the deep gift that you're giving to each one of those mothers, and we get to give at our camp and in all of our lives, in all of your life, in every book signing line and every congregant you encounter, we get to look in the eye and say, you can do this life too, even if you've seen that terrible things do happen. And
yeah.
it's just such a
You
gift
know,
to
you
do
call
that.
you call you call this podcast and a lot of what you do, the good hard. And before I knew you, or even knew of you, I had already concluded, for me the sentence was wonderful terrible,
Mm-hmm.
because after Matthew passed away, pardon me, many times people would say, well, how are you? And I hated that question because it just was so difficult to answer in a real way,
Right.
especially in the first few years after he died.
Of
And
course.
so I finally settled on what felt very true to me was, I am wonderful, terrible, because there are some wonderful things in my life that I can't believe I get to experience. I get to have. I have
Mm.
an incredible husband. We have fought hard for a good marriage, and we have, a good marriage. I have children that I love. I have work that I love. I live in a world that's, I mean, I just can list all these things
Oh,
that are
yeah.
wonderful. And at the same exact moment, there is this terrible hole where my son and his death, and nothing will change that. And it will always
Mm.
be terrible until I see Jesus again. And so it has felt really honest to me to be able to say, I'm wonderful, terrible,
Yeah.
and it be exactly what I feel,
Right.
and what I'm experiencing.
I've learned to not ask how people are doing in deep pain unless I say the word today. So I don't say
Yes.
how are you? I just
Yeah,
say how are you today, because
that's a good thing.
you're going to let them answer with a deep breath and how am I today? Because we know it's terrible. It's horrible right now. But are you okay today? And that has been very
I
helpful
like that
for me.
addition. I like that slight modification because it does recognize the total complexity of what it is to go through loss and suffering,
Mm,
and still be seeking for some way at least to flourish and thrive and live again. So I like that.
absolutely. Well, thanks. I want to ask you about you and Rick's marriage specifically, both before Matthew's passing, when you launched a church and worked together all of these years, and then after the loss of a child. I know all too well. Gosh, when we're walking with several couples right now who've lost children, and one is separated actually,
Yeah,
and will likely divorce. And it
yeah,
is just a
It breaks my heart
tragedy.
when that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the tragedy on the tragedy on the tragedy, and it's a,
Yeah.
a vicious cycle. But even before that, I'm interested for you and Rick working together, founding your
Sure.
ministry. My
Yeah.
husband and I both worked together and founded our ministry, Hope Heals. And I'll be honest, it has not been easy, and it wasn't necessarily easy in the beginning before all this happened. We've had a hard marriage in some ways because we're both strong personalities and firstborn type A's and all the things. And yet,
Yeah.
my wonderful counselor has told me that something that my stroke did was trauma bond us in a good way, which that can be a very bad thing. But the trauma bonding for us has meant we've literally been through life and death, and maybe it's made things less of a big deal between us. And I wonder if something similar would have happened
Mm.
to you and Rick.
Yeah. Well, let's see, we founded the church when we were 25,
Yeah.
and Matthew passed away when we were 59.
Yes.
So we
Okay.
had a lot of years between, the beginning of the church and when
Yes.
we
Okay.
lost Matthew.
Good point.
But we had a very difficult marriage. Sometimes, I mean, I've done podcasts or interviews that are just about marriage, and he and I taught seminars on it because it's a big topic for us. God brought us together. I'll say the shorthand is in our courtship, it's like we had an arranged marriage. God arranged it. It was not a typical courtship. It was one of those, God told me to marry you. Oh, okay, all right, I'll marry you. It was like that.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
whenever we've had problems, people will say, "Well, you chose him," and I go, "No, God chose him. I did
Yeah.
not choose him. God chose him." And so we had a very difficult relationship from the beginning. We didn't know each other. We didn't have any real skills in communication. We didn't know how to handle our differences, and we are so very different. I had experienced sexual molestation as a child, and but
Sorry.
had never had any kind of therapy or done any work on it, and so had no idea how much it really was going to affect me in my marriage. So we started married life from a lot of deficits. We had a lot of deficits, but we didn't realize it. We knew we both loved Jesus and that we were committed to each other, and those are the two things that probably held us together in the roughest times. But we have done a lot of marriage therapy. We have done a lot of work. We've done a lot of growing personally.
Hmm.
I'll just say this, not as a plug, truly not meant as a plug, but one of the things that changed our marriage was understanding the Enneagram.
Oh
Because
yeah.
for the first time, and
Oh
that could have
yeah.
saved me, thousands of dollars of marriage therapy if I'd
Seriously.
only found that
What
sooner.
is your number?
I'm a one. I'm
You
a
are?
proud and
And what's
healthy and
Rick?
recovered. A 7.
Oh goodness. Oh my goodness. So doesn't want to talk about the hard stuff. Yeah. Hard on the
He wants
marriage.
to have. He is the happiest when he's happy.
Right. Oh, for
As
sure.
a
Sevens are
one,
awesome.
I'm the happiest when things are going, when I can do things in the right way and help other people do things in the right way. That makes me happy. But what makes him happy is to be happy. So anyway, all that to
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
that was a game changer for us, and really taught us a lot about the it should be so simple. Differences are not wrong, they're just different. That
Right.
statement, if I could have understood that 40 years ago, oh my goodness, that would have been fabulous. We're coming up on 49 years of marriage, so we figured out how to
Wow.
make it work. We are each other's best friends. Suffering and losing Matthew, well, I want to take one step back. Before Matthew died, I used to worry that if Matthew were to die, that we wouldn't divorce, but that all the intimacy would be gone between us because we had so
Hmm.
much conflict about how to handle his mental illness.
Oh, for sure.
So much conflict between us about how to handle his mental illness. Felt like we could not ever be on the same page. And it used to scare me to think that if we had that much trouble when he was alive, what would his death do to our marriage? And I
Mhm.
can say that the exact opposite happened. That after Matthew died, and we came together in the sweetest ways because we realized we were the only two people on earth who knew what it was like to be his parents.
Mm.
Nobody else. I was his mother. There was no other person on the world who was his mother. There was
Yeah.
no other person who was his father, and that we had something together. I really credit Rick with how well we have done relationally since Matthew died, because Rick made the decision that he was going to share his grief with me. His
Mm.
natural inclination would be to go off in a corner, grieve by himself, think about it, process it, and then deal with it in that way. But he chose to enter into grief with me. And because of that, I feel like our marriage is stronger these 11 years later than it was even before Matthew died. But it has been intentional. And I have to say that what I have learned, it's not losing a child that will break up a marriage. It's if a marriage has some fractures and cracks in it, the stress of losing a child can then exacerbate those existing fracture lines
Mm.
that make it very hard then for some people to recover that. For us, we were able to, by God's grace, come together in our grief, even though we've grieved very differently, and decided that we were not going to, the enemy had already taken so much from us. We
Right.
were not
Oh,
going to let him take our
right.
marriage too.
Yes, that is a beautiful thing to say. I'm struck in this moment by just so many couples we know and who might hear this, listeners who might hear these words. That what would you say um, to that for a couple whose child is living but may not? Um, what should they do to help safeguard their marriage from completely falling apart after?
Yeah. Um, we did not, we had done a lot of marriage counseling and therapy in the earlier years of our marriage,
Mm-hmm.
but when Matthew was doing so poorly toward the end, we did not. We were putting all of our energy into trying to keep him alive, trying
Right.
to help him survive, and we neglected ourselves and our
Mm.
marriage in
Mm-hmm.
that process.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that we had put some of our energy into us. And I would
Mm.
say to anybody who's listening, who's living that out right now, there's, Frederick Buechner has this quote. His daughter had an eating disorder, and it nearly killed him
Mm.
in the
Yeah.
process of the ways that he was, and hurt his marriage. And he said, "What good is a bleeding heart if it bleeds to death?"
Oh,
And
yes.
so we nearly bled to death in our marriage because we were bleeding so for our son. And so I would really encourage any couple to really invest in your relationship, because ultimately you will do better. You will handle your child's mental illness better if you are more on some kind of a oneness or more on page together.
I know I've been to probably, 7 or 8 funerals of campers from our camp who passed away. And just watching the parents walk through that process, especially in the last year before the child dies, there's no time for thinking about your marriage. It's all about the child. But that I'm hearing from you, and I completely agree, is really short sighted.
It
That
is.
the marriage must be a priority in that
Because if
season.
you lose a child, and it sounds like in some of the people that you minister to and with, Catherine, their child is likely to die due to
Yes,
their illness, their disability, their accident, whatever. And so with that in the picture, all the more reason to work on your marriage now, because
absolutely.
after, if that child were to pass away, you
Yes,
are going to need each other in ways that you have never needed each other before.
yes.
Never. You are
I
going to need each other. And so it is an investment in, and I hope this doesn't sound cheesy. It just popped into my head, but I really do believe it. Your child wants you to survive. Your
mm,
child wants your marriage,
mm.
a healthy marriage wants that healthy marriage to survive.
Oh,
And
yes.
so we do it for ourselves, but we're actually doing it for our children and our other children. And it is an investment in ourselves and in our family and in our community for our marriages to survive.
Well,
and thrive.
and for so many, excuse me, for so many of our sweet just camp family from Hope Hills, there are other typically able-bodied children in the family. So when the sibling dies, and stop crying, I'm sorry, and the parents' marriage falls apart, then those typical able-bodied children are left with just double deep horror, sadness, and tragedy.
Yes.
So
The multiplied sadness, the multiplied
yeah,
tragedy. Yeah. All of
it
that.
really is. I teed you up in a big way to say that because I want to scream that from the mountaintops. Listener, if you're dealing with an unrelated crisis, make your marriage a priority, like another, because your other children need you too, and need you to be around together. And it's
we don't in the world of mental health, we don't typically talk about the effect on siblings, but it can be deep and wounding and marking. It can be both.
Yeah.
There's a lot that you learn from having a sibling who has a struggle, whether it's physical or mental, that's good. I mean, there's some things that shape you in a good way, and there's some things that shape you in a very negative and traumatic way. And so I feel what I'm hearing you say is that siblings are the forgotten, sometimes participants in the family, and then they are definitely the forgotten mourners.
Right.
Siblings I can't tell you the number of people that came up to my kids and said, how are your parents doing? They didn't even start with how are you? But it was like bypassing my surviving children's suffering to how are your parents doing? And again, all around that whole idea of strengthening families where we can for the long term.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. Sounds like our missions are quite aligned, Kay.
They're very parallel.
Yeah, and I know, and we're reading the same writings and know the same people. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, goodness, it has been such a gift to speak to you. And I would love to ask you in closing the question I like to ask everybody on the GoodHard Story Podcast, which is, Kay, what is good in your life? What is hard in your life, and how do you live in the tension of both in your GoodHard story?
What is good is my relationship with God. The suffering and the trauma and the agony tried to shake the tree of my faith, and I can praise God that the roots held. And because of that, God is more mysterious to me. I understand him less. I know I can explain less. Probably I've been a Christian since I was 8 years old, and I just turned 70. So I have been a Christian a very long time. And there is less about him that I can explain, but I am more deeply connected to God than I have ever been. And that is good. And I'm so grateful because the circumstances of my life really threatened my faith.
Right.
So that is good. My relationship, as I said, with my husband after nearly 50 years of marriage and we have battled long and hard, blood, sweat, and tears to build a good marriage. But we are friends. We said to each other just yesterday, you drive me crazy, but you keep me sane. So that's probably that another way to say that for us, for many, many years, our every couple has their song, and our song was Huey Lewis and the News' Happy to Be Stuck with You, which is a kind of a sardonic, tongue-in-cheek song about the differences. But at the end of the day, I'm happy to be stuck with you. But after Matthew died and all that we have gone through and walked through together, our song now is You're the Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me. Oh, Gladys Knight. And we get weepy and emotional and all goopy, soppy and, sappy because really we can see each other as the best thing that ever happened to each other. So my connection with God is good. My marriage is good. I'm close with my children. I love the work that I do. I love the world that God has made, even though it's broken and fractured and a bit of a dumpster fire. there is such beauty
Yeah,
in the world that I
totally.
can hardly stand it. It's
Mm,
so beautiful.
mm,
What's bad in my life is that I have to live every single day here now until I meet Jesus without my son Matthew. And that's not just bad, it's terrible. It's horrible. And I will miss him. And I cannot wait until he runs to meet me whole and in his right mind. But I know that he'll be right behind Jesus. This is my fantasy, that right behind Jesus will be Matthew running. And he is right now currently in that cloud of witnesses cheering me on. Even though when he was alive, my mental health work made him angry because he felt it was useless and hopeless and I was wasting my time and he got mad at me. But
mm.
I know that healed Matthew in heaven is in that crowd of witnesses cheering me on.
Oh gosh,
Go, mom. Go, mom.
yeah,
Go, mom.
he is. Matthew is. Yeah,
And
goodness, so
until
proud.
that day, until the day that I see him again face to face, I will live with tears in my eyes. I will miss him, and
Mm,
nothing and no one can make that any different or any better for me. I miss him, and it's terrible.
mm,
Um, how I'm living in the in between is um, because my hope is absolutely certain. It is not in earthly outcomes because earthly outcomes have already let me down, have already disappointed me.
mm,
Earthly outcomes have not been the way I thought they would be.
mm.
But 1 Corinthians 15 talks about, Paul says, these bodies of ours, they are buried in brokenness, but they will be raised in strength. They were buried in weakness, but they will be raised. Sorry, they were buried in brokenness. They will be raised in glory. We were buried in weakness, but we will be raised in strength. That is a certain hope. I can stand at the cemetery. I can stand looking at my son's headstone. And every time I do, I say it to the watching spirit world and anyone who cares to hear. Matthew, your body was buried in brokenness, but you will be raised in glory. You were buried in weakness, but you will be raised in strength. And I know that one day I will be buried personally. I will die. I will be buried in brokenness, but I will be raised in glory. I will be buried in weakness, but I will be raised in strength. And that is what helps me hold on. That's my hope. That is certain. That is an outcome that cannot be taken away from me. I believe it with my whole heart. Because of that, I'm willing to get up every day, look for the beauty, look for the ways that God can use me, choose joy, live with tears in my eyes,
Mm.
and wait for that glorious resurrection day, because it's coming.
Oh, oh my word. You're just so amazing. Oh my gosh. I'm so, oh, wow. Yeah, that was a good answer, Kay. Oh my word. I want to be you when I grow up. I do. I am so inspired by your life and your words and your heart. And yeah, just thank you so much for being here and sharing with my little corner of the world and providing the true hope that will last
Yeah.
through all the sadness and suffering. And
Katherine, I can't wait till we can be together in person because I'm going to hug your neck so tight and we're going to cry together and we're going to laugh together. And I hope it happens this year sometime.
I do too. I would love that. And I get to California a good bit, so maybe it actually will. I'm gonna seek you out.
I, you better, because I can't wait.
Well, what
Love
a
you.
oh, love you already, Kay. You're an amazing, amazing, inspiring woman.